Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dean Bill Traynor, and it's a privilege to welcome you to this year's Thomas Ryan Lecture. Thomas Ryan received his bachelor degrees from Georgetown College in 1971 and his JD from the Law Center in 1976. He was an extraordinary person, and he passed away much too young. And this lecture was created in his honor. And it has now been, I think, more than 30 years. Started in 1985. It's one of the jewels every year in the law school's academic program. We started in 1985 with Senator Joe Biden. We have had, among other people, Anne Marie Slaughter, Dean Martha Minow, Nobel Prize winner George Akerlof, and last year we heard from Craig Stephen Wilder, the Barton Weller Professor of History at MIT. Mr. Ryan is survived by his wife Christine, his two children, Thomas and Missy. Missy joins us here today. And we're fortunate today to have really an extraordinary speaker. Mary Sarah Bilder, Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. And I have to say, I have been reading Professor Bilder's work since really the start of her career, and just have the most profound admiration and have learned so much from her. And when she accepted our offer to deliver this lecture, I was beyond delighted. So I'm looking forward to the lecture and to actually formally introduce her. Let me call to the stage our Associate Dean for Research and Academic Programs, John McKyle.
Thank you, Dean Traynor. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to the 2019 Ryan Lecture and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mary Sarah Bilder. The purpose of this lecture series is to bring first-rate scholars, policymakers, and public intellectuals to Georgetown to expand our horizons and invite us to think more critically about important and challenging topics. Although there are many such topics, few are more in need of fresh insight and critical inquiry than the role, status, and hidden agency of women at the time of the American founding. It's a commonplace that gender is virtually invisible in the United States Constitution and in the vast majority of books, articles, and commentaries on that document, which trace how it was drafted, adopted, and put into operation by the founding generation. We know, of course, that women were among the people of the United States who were present at the founding, thinking, feeling, reading, writing, debating, aspiring, making demands on themselves and on others. It's also clear that we cannot have an adequate understanding of those activities unless we take the time and effort to investigate them. Yet few people have done so. It is against this backdrop that I'm so pleased and honored to introduce Professor Bilder as this year's Ryan Lecturer. She is one of the country's most accomplished historians, whose scholarship has already had an extraordinary impact on our understanding of the Constitution and the broader legal culture from which it emerged. There is no scholar of the founding era whose work I admire more or read more eagerly. And there is no one who is better equipped to draw back the curtain on today's intriguing topic, female genius in the age of the Constitution. Mary Sarah Bilder is the Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School, where she has taught since 1994. She received her undergraduate degree with honors from the University of Wisconsin and her law degree and PhD from Harvard University. She is the author of 2 books and the editor of 2 others, along with many influential essays, articles, and book chapters. Professor Bilder's first book, The Transatlantic Constitution, skillfully traces the relationship between colonial legal culture and traditional sources of British constitutional authority. The book was published to wide critical acclaim in 2004 and received the Littleton Griswold Award from the American Historical Association. Her most recent book, Madison's Hand, is a path-breaking study of one of the most important manuscripts in American history, James Madison's Notes of the Constitutional Convention. On the basis of years of meticulous and painstaking research, Professor Bilder persuasively argues that all of Madison's notes for approximately the last month of the convention, as well as other key debates earlier that summer, were revised by Madison at least 2 years after the fact. That is, no earlier than the fall of 1789. The significance of this discovery stems from the fact that from the moment Madison's notes first appeared in 1840, our legal and political culture has generally taken for granted that they are a contemporaneous record and virtual transcript of how the Constitution was drafted. Madison's Hand forces us to come to grips with a different and more accurate conception of the notes and Madison's role in composing and revising them. The stakes of this interpretive enterprise are raised once one realizes how many important features of the Constitution trace their origin to the last month of the convention, and how critical Madison's role was in shaping the emerging public understanding of the Constitution in hotly contested debates about its meaning throughout the first decade of the Republic. Among the many awards Madison's Hand has received are the Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy and the James Bradford Biography Prize from the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic. In my view, the book's lessons have not yet fully been digested, a process that will take time. What is clear is that it has changed minds and permanently transformed the conversation. As one commentator put it, as a result of Professor Bilder's efforts, we will never read Madison's notes the same way again. That's an extraordinary accomplishment, but it is just one of her many achievements in a career that is still skyrocketing. As her lecture today will illustrate, she has not rested on her laurels, but rather is tackling exciting new topics in order to deepen our understanding of the founding era. Now, I have been known to say that the best introductions, much like the best associate deans, are short. The second point is debatable, but the first is undoubtedly convincing. The person you have come to hear today is Professor Bilder, so I will now happily invite her to the podium. Let me just conclude by simply saying how much I admire her scholarship and emphasizing what an honor it is to have her with us today to deliver the 2019 Ryan Lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Sarah Bilder.
I think that was the nicest introduction anyone has ever given. And I'm like going to be like, can you send that to my folks? Because they'd be so happy to hear it. I want to thank Dean Traynor and Professor Mikhail for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak at a place with so many friends and so many fellow travelers in constitutional and legal history. And I'm honored to give this lecture, which has hosted really such an impressive group of scholars. I'm a little shocked to find myself among them. So first, let me open my water here. We're going to dim the lights if we can because you're going to see this is really an illustrated lecture in all sorts of ways. The founding of Georgetown, this is a particularly special place to do this lecture because the founding of Georgetown initially as an academy coincided with the story that I'm going to tell this afternoon. In 1786, 1787, plans and proposals were circulated. In 1788, construction began, and in 1791, students were enrolled. And indeed, I think it's possible that the largely unknown lady about who I'm going to talk was in Georgetown in 1789, as her husband was then attempting to start a new magazine, the Potomac Magazine. And so this afternoon, I'm going to talk about a largely unknown lady, Eliza Harriot O'Connor, who lectured in the university in Philadelphia during the Constitutional Convention. And she insisted that she was an example to be imitated and improved on, as she put it, by others. And I believe her example mattered. And so she's going to be our guide first to the 1770s and 1780s to learn about female genius. And I have a few too many waters here, I think. And then to the summer of 1787, where she gave public lectures in Philadelphia and perhaps in some way influenced the Constitution. And then to the 1790s to explore the limits of women's rights. So I have a coffee table picture book approach to the slides. So if we can even bring the slides, them down a little bit lower, I'd be perfectly happy with that. I hate public speaking, and so I'm actually super happy if all you do is stare at the slides, okay? And let me get this ready here, and then we'll be off. Nearly 150 years ago, in 1872, Victoria Woodhull ran for president. She was the first woman to do so. But since then, only men have ever been elected. And the 19 apparently male pronouns relating to the president might actually suggest that women were excluded intentionally or that the framers could not imagine inclusion. But in March 1788, Pennsylvanian Hugh Henry Brackenridge read the Constitution as open to a female president. His essay mocked the myriad criticisms of the Constitution. Brackenridge began, "The first thing that strikes a diligent observer is the want of precaution with respect to the sex of the president. Is it provided that he shall be of the male gender?" He added, "What shall we think if in the process of time we shall come to have an old woman at the head of our affairs?" And then Brackenridge went on to say, "What security have we that he shall be a white man?" And his views on both possibilities are ambiguous, but he revealed the Constitution's semantic gender tolerance. And the classic images of the framers, Jefferson's so-called assembly of demigods, depict the founding without any reference to women. There are no demigoddesses in the picture. And yet recall that Clio, the muse of history, was herself a demigoddess, the child of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the titan of memory. And history creates power by selecting what we remember about the past. And we have misremembered the imaginative space around women and politics. And it's for this reason that Clio has inspired so many prominent female artists. The two images here are of Artemisia Gentileschi and Angelica Kauffman, the first women admitted to male art associations. Now, so for me, this question arose over one entry in George Washington's diary from May 1787. Washington was waiting in Philadelphia for the convention to start. He'd been at tea at financier Robert Morris's house, and then he went with Mary White Morris and other ladies to hear a lady read at the college hall. Washington later wrote, "The reading had been a charity affair, because the lady, being reduced in circumstance, had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. He judged her performance tolerable," which is, of course, what Mr. Darcy says of Eliza, and so I judge her performance a relative success. And this lady was Eliza Harriot O'Connor. Her lecture was one aspect of an ambitious vision. So who was this lady? She was Eliza Harriot Behrens O'Connor, and she called herself Eliza Harriot, which is what I will call her. She left no papers, she had no children, but she's not been entirely unknown. She appears in Thomas Woody's important female education history, Charles Warren's classic Making of the Constitution, the George Washington Papers, and recently an essay by Professor Granville Ganter on early women lecturers. She has no portrait, but perhaps she resembled her cousin, Catherine Hardy, who's depicted here in this wonderful Thomas Lawrence portrait. She was born in Lisbon, and she grew up in England as a member of the aspiring gentry, educated at an elite boarding school. Her mother's families were Hardys, a prominent merchant and naval family. Her grandfather and uncle were admirals and sirs. Two uncles served as governors of New York and New Jersey. Her father served as the Boston port collector and as postmaster in Charleston before retiring to Ramsgate, a seaside town. And in 1776, she married John O'Connor, an Irish law student at the Inner Temple. He appeared to be a gentleman, albeit impoverished, with unverified hints of connections to Irish royal families. And after he became a barrister in Dublin, they returned to London in the early 1780s. There her father died, leaving her the modest income of a trust independent of her husband's control. The 1780s were what I call the age of the Constitution, and I'm using Constitution in its older sense, what we sometimes call the small c Constitution. Prior to 1787, Constitution referred to the framework of government and the way in which government was constituted, who participated. And the Constitution in this sense was being reformed in the United States, Ireland, and England, with alterations in assumptions about who should participate in the state. So for women, this age of the Constitution raised the possibility of altering an intellectual tradition that bounded female capacity. As far back as Aristotle, the Western tradition had embraced an ideology of female inferiority. Influential educational theorists, for example, Rousseau, explained, the whole education of women ought to be relative to men. He noted, reader, I appeal to you, be sincere. Which would you esteem the most? A woman whom you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex in her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette, surrounded with pamphlets of all sorts? And this constitutional reform was accompanied in England by recognition of female genius. The 9 Muses of Britain was painted showing contemporary female geniuses as proof that Britain was entering a golden age. African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley gained recognition as a female genius. In London, female debating societies debated female representation. And in the New American United States in 1783, in Princeton, in front of George Washington and Congress, the young graduate Edmund Snowden argued to expand female education. He noted, nay, there are none of the learned and important employments of life which the female mind has not proved itself able to comprehend and direct. Catherine Macaulay, the great English historian, embodied the connection from female genius to political inclusion when she was painted wearing the Roman senatorial sash. As the Scottish military officer and writer Alexander Jardine prophesied, the nation that shall first introduce women to their councils, their senates, their seminaries of learning, will probably accelerate most the advances of human nature in wisdom and happiness. And in 1786, Eliza, Harriot, and John moved to New York, capital of the United States. She established an extraordinary French and English academy for young women from powerful political families, Temple, Macomb, Hillegas, Knox. Her advertisements emphasized female genius. And in the fall, her school gave public examinations at Columbia College, in which Columbia professors participated. One wonders if she met William Samuel Johnson, later convention delegate, soon to be elected first president of Columbia. She seemed almost to be on her way to imagine a young ladies' college. But in a pattern that would repeat itself, John's career decisions altered hers. He was hired as the editor for the Philadelphia Columbia magazine, and they moved to Philadelphia in early 1787, where a convention was to meet to revise the existing federal constitution. Philadelphia was diverse and cosmopolitan, the largest city in the United States with approximately 40,000 people. In 1787, reform seemed to be in the air. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery reorganized, with Benjamin Franklin as president and opening to non-Quakers. The Reverend Absalom Jones and the formerly enslaved Richard Allen formed the Free African Society to support the free black population. And in 1787, other societies organized to offer reform-oriented solutions to societal problems, the modern penitentiary, and the then very popular humane societies, which at the time referred to recovering people who had apparently died from drowning. People imagined that the convention foreshadowed a rising new reformist empire. And the summer of 1787 was an embodiment of the age of the Constitution. Reform interested the remarkable group of elite Philadelphia women. In 1780, Esther Reed's pamphlet had created the Ladies' Association of Philadelphia and proclaimed a new American woman. And the larger community of civic-focused women included Annice Boudinot Stockton, salon leader and correspondent of Washington, her daughter Julia, wife to Benjamin Rush, Mary White Morris, married to financier and convention delegate Robert Morris, Sally Bache Franklin, daughter of Benjamin Franklin and then president of the Ladies' Association, and Eliza Willing Powell, who referred to herself as Washington's best friend, and her niece, Anne Bingham. Beginning Monday, April 2nd, 1787, in every Philadelphia newspaper, Eliza Harriot's ads appeared for a course of lectures at the university on language and eloquence. And she gave at least 5 lectures, likely more, in April, May, and June of 1787. Her selections were from classics, Milton, Shakespeare, and Pope, political reformers and proto-romantics, James Thompson, Edward Young, William Shenstone, and the influential lawyer and Orientalist, Sir William Jones. Women were represented as authors, Madame de Genlis, the first women to teach the French royal children, and as subjects in Xenophon's story of General Cyrus's respect for Panthea. And she even apparently delivered the prayer on Demosthenes from the Oration of the Crown, the most famous political plea. Her selections were cosmopolitan and linked by an underlying theory that universal emotional response proved universal equality. And Washington's presence at her May 18th lecture led to accounts of her lecture to be reprinted across the United States. For example, in New England, her recitation of Demosthenes was used as a critique of the absent Rhode Island delegation. Eliza Harriot's lectures were part of a larger ambition. Indeed, her lecture was postponed to likely permit Washington's attendance. As the first convention delegates began to arrive in Philadelphia, a newspaper column praised the lady lecturer and her effort to cultivate and adorn the human mind. She was an example that in this country, the ladies are found in the society of the sages of the other sex, and they would soon command the honors due to the professors of science. Soon the toilette and the drawing room, the correspondent said, would be deserted for the forum and the college. Eliza Harriot's lectures were designed to encourage women to enter the forum, politics, and the college, advanced education. And then in early June 1787, Eliza Harriot revealed her plan for a female Academy of Belles Lettres to be called the French Academy of Philadelphia. Its board would be half women, half men. And a woman was to lead it who was capable of reading French and lecturing publicly to 300 people. Eliza Harriot explained her purpose. The exertions of a female should be an example to be imitated and improved on. Her early attempt would promote more mature efforts by future women who would emulate her. She wanted to be an example, but not the exceptional example that had always perversely been used as evidence of most other women's inferiority, but as an example to be improved and emulated. She held herself out as the first step. And she sent her plan to Sarah Bache Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's daughter. And she may have inspired Anne Bingham's early June letter to Thomas Jefferson, praising the education of French women and their happy variety of genius. As Anne explained, such women assert our female privileges. And Anne wrote Jefferson, they should be as mired as much as the friends of liberty of mankind reverence the successful struggles of the American patriots. And so day after day, throughout the summer of 1787, the Philadelphia newspapers ran advertisements referring to lectures by a lady. My husband says this looks like the Red Sox opening schedule, and I was like, I guess it does, but it's actually not that, okay? The dark red are days in which I know she gave a lecture. Because the Society of the Cincinnati and the Synod of the Presbyterian Church were meeting in Philadelphia, a who's who list was available to have potentially attended her May lectures. Noah Webster attended on May 18th and May 21st, and the list of people who could have attended or did attend is large. And if her June 21st lecture was attended by delegates, with the exception of the New Hampshire delegation, most other delegates could have been present. But enter Benjamin Rush. Rush was 41 years old, only 3 or 4 years older than Eliza Harriot. He had a remarkable, capacious mind, was anti-slavery, and involved in various reformist enterprises. He'd married Julia Stockton when she was 17, and who was then occupied with raising their 13 children. And at the time of Eliza Harriot's lectures, Rush served on the all-male board of the Young Ladies Academy. The Academy's opening is curiously uncertain, but it's often dated to June 4th, 1787. The men embraced female education as long as they were in charge. A rival school run by a public, lecturing British woman teaching French with women on the board was a threat. And who knows what was going on behind the scenes in July, but in late July, Rush gave a widely reprinted speech, Thoughts upon Female Education. It was designed to destroy Eliza Harriot's plan. As the great historian Mary Benson noted a century ago, the talk did not show great originality. Rush simply gave an old idea an American twist. Gentlemen should direct female education. French should not be taught. British ideas were un-American. Young ladies should be educated to be, as he put it, an agreeable companion for a sensible man and the daughter or wife of an American citizen. Rush was imitated by Noah Webster. Webster had tried to make money lecturing in Philadelphia, but he had failed. He went to 2 of Eliza Harriot's lectures, and he insisted they were dull. In his essay, he insisted female education should focus only on what was useful. As he put it, however ambitious a woman may be to command admiration abroad, her real merit is known only at home. Historians have interpreted Rush and Webster as the most expansive views on female education, an idea often described as Republican motherhood. But it represented instead a reaction designed to confine Eliza Harriot and a female vision of the fundamental equality of women. Eliza Harriot stood no chance. In early July, she had begun to advertise a new lecture on the faculties of the human mind. But as her ads ran through July and into August, she seemed never to have sold enough tickets to give it, and her academy never opened. And instead, at Rush's Young Ladies Academy, the notebooks the girls used proclaimed on the front, the end of a good education is not that they should become dancers, singers, players, or painters. Its real object is to make them good daughters, good wives, good mistresses, good members of society, and good Christians. And nonetheless, Eliza Harriot's example may have had invisible influence that summer. In state constitutions drafted between 1776 and 1787, political participants are described in various ways. Some neutral, person, inhabitant. Some generic, he, man. And some gender specific. So, for example, the 1776 New Jersey Constitution was neutral. All inhabitants were entitled to vote. And in contrast, the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution was gender-specific. Every male inhabitant could vote. And gender-specific language was proposed for the new Constitution. In 2007, Professor Rob Nadelson footnoted some of these revisions in an Ohio State article discussing differences between subjective intent and public meaning analysis. The first draft of the Constitution described Congress as 2 separate and distinct bodies of men. The pernicious 3/5 clause explicitly referenced inhabitants of every sex, And the draft Fugitive Slave Clause emphasized that men or women, he or she, escaping to a free state, would be returned to slavery. And note how escape by enslaved African American women was so prominent in some of the delegates' minds that it's the one place where the word she originally showed up. But the final drafting committee removed every gendered reference. Congress was no longer bodies of men. Person or persons replaced he or she. And these changes created a neutral constitution. Perhaps they were the result of lead drafter and close summer companion of Washington and Eliza, Harriot, possibly Gouverneur Morris, maybe in the audience for her lecture. Persons referenced inhabitants of every sex, and he was a generic pronoun. And for textualists, the Interstate Rendition Clause, Article 4, Section 2, proves this because otherwise women who commit treason, felony, and other crimes and flee across state lines escape free. But we can see the remarkable consistency of the Constitution's use of the neutral person he pattern to describe the various offices, and never once did the word male appear. Rush's opposition doomed Eliza Harriot's academy. And in the fall of 1787, she moved to Baltimore in hopes of giving her lecture on the compass of the human mind. Baltimore likely seemed promising with a reformed community, including Benjamin Banneker, who was just beginning to study astronomy. Questions may have been raised about her female authorship because her ads now emphasized that they had been written by the advertiser and had never appeared in print. And another significant woman, Mary Goddard, famed female printer of the first version of the Declaration of Independence, with signatures, sold tickets. And meanwhile, Eliza Harriot's husband gathered money for his planned history of America. But Baltimore proved unsuccessful, and in the spring of 1788, Eliza Harriot moved to Alexandria. She carried a letter of introduction to George Washington, and her proposed female school emphasized the art of reading, with exams to promote emulation. Emulation is a key word. A century earlier, feminist educational reformer Mary Anstell justified publication to show the product of a woman's pen and to excite a generous emulation in my sex, to persuade them to leave their insignificant pursuits for employments worthy of them. Indeed, by the 18th century, emulation was associated with Enlightenment progress, so the Scottish philosopher David Hume wrote that a speaker's elocution could rouse the genius of a nation and excite the emulation of youth. And Eliza Harriot's emphasis of emulation as example was in this vein. Washington passively supported her school, insisting he was too busy to sit on the board. And Eliza Harriot's husband also achieved success. He gave the July 4th address in Norfolk, praising Washington as the father of his country, one of the early uses of that phrase. But success was not to be, and by October, Eliza Harriot invited herself to Mount Vernon to consult with the General and Mrs. Washington. John was moving to North Carolina to head a seminary, and Eliza Harriot felt she had to go too. She wrote Washington she was resolved in every situation to unite my best endeavors for our common benefit. My best endeavors revealed her independent identity, but our common benefit emphasized the reality of married women's legal coverture and her commitment to her marriage. And so off they went. Now, our common benefit, in fact, often seems to mean Eliza Harriot's endeavors, because nothing really worked out for John. In 1789, he failed at starting a new magazine in Georgetown. His history never materialized. Subscribers complained. The Washington paper editors saw him as a near fraudster. For myself, he serves as a reminder of how chancy success was for immigrants without family wealth. His publishing schemes would be accomplished by men with better American connections. Eliza Harriot at this time might have tried her own hand at authorship. One E. O'Connor published 2 novels, one in London in 1789, the other in Dublin, both with biographical details oddly similar to her life. But not surprisingly, they moved on, and in 1790 they went to Charleston, where again she offered her lecture as advertisement for her female French and English Academy. Her audience was not only women, she planned to improve the enunciation of youth intending to pursue professions in which eloquence is indispensable, law or ministry. And perhaps because of connections made when her father briefly served there, or more uncomfortably, perhaps because of the socioeconomic advantage of whiteness in a city built on slavery, Charleston was successful for her, and her school flourished. She and John both taught, and she hired a Mr. Johnston, recommended by William and Mary to teach. Her curriculum included the sciences, astronomy, and geography, and she bought a new terrestrial and celestial globes. John even abandoned his planned men's school to help alleviate her toil. Their published goal was that the American lady would rank preeminently in science and accomplishment. Her students were aspiring gentry. The prize list includes the daughter of Abraham Thesprotus, a prosperous Jewish French immigrant. And they seemed to be moving towards stability. When Washington came to town on his southern tour, John gave an oration linking efforts to liberty across the Atlantic to a golden age of justice, with Washington cast as global hero. Now I have to pause here and tell you my favorite story about anything. Okay, so on the Southern tour is also when you get this wonderful famous painting story. So no, this is just if you ever go to Charleston, you can see this. So Charleston commissioned Trumbull to paint a picture to commemorate this. And so Trumbull painted this wonderful picture that you see on the top of Washington, and he painted it about Trenton, which is what you would actually paint if you were painting Washington. But Charleston was like, you misunderstood us because we wanted Charleston in the picture. And so they refused to pay for it until he painted them a new one. And so he painted them a new picture of Washington to commemorate the Southern tour, and he put Charleston in it, but he reversed the horse, and Charleston is in the picture right underneath the horse's rear end. Okay. And weirdly, I didn't believe this, and it's hanging in Charleston even today. So they were like, fine, it's a good painting. Okay, so now we'll move on to the 1790s. Eliza Harriot believed that women were equal to men, and we find glimpses of others who shared this view. For example, in 1790, a remarkable paragraph appeared in numerous newspapers. The anonymous author contrasted the alleged age of liberality with the present custom of excluding women from any share in legislation. Exclusion was seen as a custom, not a legally required bar. Women should not be obliged to submit to laws they had no share of making. It was unjust and detrimental because women are equal to the males. And Esther Boardman, the person depicted here, didn't write it, but her portrait is representative of so many portraits of women in this period reading Finger in their book, which is how male professionals were depicted. Female education proved that women were equal of males, and so education was part of a political platform. In 1787, in London, Mary Wollstonecraft published Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. Wollstonecraft was a decade younger than Eliza Harriot, but she had similarly tried to found a school. In fact, that book included the wonderfully titled chapter, The Unfortunate Situation of Females, Fashionably Educated and Left Without a Fortune. And her daughter, Mary Shelley, would later go on to write Frankenstein. In 1790, the great historian Catherine Macaulay similarly published Letters on Female Education. Both writers emphasized female education for female sake and assumed female equality. Wollstonecraft wrote to Macaulay, "You are the only female writer who I consider in opinion, with respect the rank our sex ought to attain in the world. You contend for laurels, while most of our sex only seek flowers." Laurels, public praise, recalls Eliza Harriot's dream of the college and the forum. Female education was the linchpin of female inclusion in constitutional politics. Indeed, these years saw the dramatic expansion of female education by women. Mary Kelly's wonderful book, Learning to Stand and Speak, illustrates some of these efforts. And increasingly, these efforts adopted aspirational names like Academy and Seminary. The author Hannah Foster offered advice to women via a fictional boarding school. Playwright and best-selling novelist Susanna Rosen founded a school in Boston for young ladies. In Philadelphia's African-American community, Grace Bustle Douglas, founding member of the biracial Female Anti-Slavery Society, helped to start a school for African-American girls, including the famous Fortin sisters. Sarah Pierce founded the remarkable Litchfield Female Academy, a school that over 3 decades educated over 3,000 women, notably the 2 Beecher sisters. Female education emphasized elocution, what Eliza Harriot referred to as the art of reading. And the elocution movement believed that the art of speaking would improve morality and constitutional government. In 1789, women became a target audience with the publication of The Female Reader. Mr. Creswick, teacher of elocution and the author, was none other than Wollstonecraft. She included numerous selections by women, including herself, and Jane Austen would give a similar later text to her niece. The art of reading became a device to allow young women to invade public spaces. As Wollstonecraft acknowledged in the preface to The Female Reader, here's the problem. It is seen as a breach of modesty for a woman to obtrude her person or talents on the public when necessity does not justify and spur her on. But to be able to read with propriety is a very desirable attainment. And so public exams and public graduations created a need to allow female talents to be obtruded on the public. As Carolyn Eastman points out in her splendid book, A Nation of Speechifiers, many young women in the 1790s gave public graduation oratories. Most celebrated is the 1793 Young Ladies Academy address of Priscilla Mason. Mason protested the limits on women. Supposing now we possessed all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, the Senate are shut against us. Who shut them? Man, despotic man. First made us incapable of the duty and then forbid us the exercise. Let us by suitable education qualify ourselves for those high departments and they will open before us. The trajectory was clear. Education, oratory, and the doors of the Senate and the bar would open. This logical connection between female education and female political participation appeared most famously in Wollstonecraft's January 1792, A Vindication on the Rights of Woman. The book is markedly similar to her early educational treatise, wrapped now in the rhetoric of rights. As Wollstonecraft scholars emphasize, the book was initially widely praised. The recently formed Ladies magazine favorably reviewed the work over 9 pages, noting, "Let women share the rights, and she will emulate the virtues of man, for she will grow more perfect when emancipated." Indeed, in December, the magazine portrayed the book being given to liberty by the genius of the magazine and the genius of emulation. Aaron Burr found reflected in Wollstonecraft's work his commitment to his own daughter's education, and he commissioned a copy of her picture. In certain respects, Wollstonecraft was simply writing what other women were implying. In fact, the controversial paragraph in which Wollstonecraft suggests political participation begins with a lament that women of a superior caste have not had a road open by which they can pursue more extensive plans of usefulness and independence. Eliza Harriot could not have said it better. And then Wollstonecraft writes what would become the one controversial sentence in the book. "I may excite laughter by dropping a hint, which I mean to pursue some future time. For I really think that women ought to have representatives, instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share allowed them in the deliberation of government." Did Wollstonecraft know that her hint was not laughed at everywhere? The imagined future existed in New Jersey. Historians have known that women voted in New Jersey, but it was treated as an irrelevant exception and aberration. In the last 2 decades, led by the late Jan Ellen Lewis, scholars have reinterpreted it to show that restrictions on female political participation were not universal. Women voted in New Jersey under a state constitution that stated that all inhabitants could vote if they were worth 50 pounds. In theory, married women could not vote because coverture prevented them from having a legal existence outside of their husbands. And so voters, in theory, were single-propertied women over 21 and widows. In 1790, legislation explicitly used he or she to describe who was eligible to vote. And 7 years later, another law referred to his or her ballot. And extant poll lists show many women voted. Indeed, a critic in the early 1800s complained that 10,000 women had voted under these laws. But this vision, like Eliza Harriot's example, soon collapsed. In the spring of 1792, a large financial crisis rocked the United States. And the collapse of stock and land speculation would give rise to responses that marked the beginning of the New York Stock Exchange. Like many aspiring Americans, John seems to have held securities and shares in land speculations. Coverture, which allowed for no independent economic existence for married women, threw Eliza Harriot into economic crisis, as she put it. She published an ad to excuse the interruption in her business, inevitably produced by the disorder in Mr. O'Connor's pecuniary engagements. She assured her readers John had promised to discharge all the relative duties of his station with more circumspection. She released her dower rights, and over 1,000 acres of their property went to auction. And she said she would return to the classroom. If any profits should result in their united labors, it is Mr. O'Connor's determined disposition to pay his remaining creditors in due time. Once again, united labors seem mostly to have been Eliza Harriot. And they left, perhaps fleeing debts, following the path Washington took on his Southern tour. In the fall of 1792 in Savannah, she offered a new lecture planning to read Demosthenes, Longinus, Cicero, Quintilian. She offered a new school, but to no avail. In January, they were in Augusta because Georgia was appropriating funds for education, and her ad hoped that it would extend to those who wanted to enlarge the female mind. But once again, she found no takers. And so in the fall of 1793, they returned to South Carolina, now Columbia, the new capital. Eliza Harriot advertised a female seminary devoted to improving the female mind. She framed it cautiously, improving the female mind in the many arts it is capable to attain without interruption to the domestic duties which ladies are expected to discharge at a mature period of life. And yet one hears still her insistence on the female mind as capable and only being interrupted by social expectations. And then my sources fade after a 1793 ad by John. He vanishes despite hours of searching for him. Perhaps he headed off to Ireland, perhaps debt caught up to him, perhaps he died. And Eliza Harriot almost disappears also. There's one glimpse of her in 1799. In one of the few extant Columbia newspapers, her ad appears. She thanks her friends for supporting her feeble attempts at teaching. Feeble seems a sad commentary on her once lofty ambition, and yet one hears almost immediately afterwards her persistent old entrepreneurialism in her new proposal to open a school to teach French. How long did she keep teaching? I don't know. Eliza Harriot's decline reflected the decline of the belief that the recognition of female genius, the education of young women, the acquisition of elocution would send women to the college and forum. In 1798, Philadelphian Charles Brockden Brown, often seen as the first significant American novelist, published essays entitled The Rights of Women, a Dialogue. And they depict a dialogue between Mrs. Carter, whose name evoked the blue-stocking Elizabeth Carter, actually depicted in the Nine Muses painting that started this lecture, and a young liberal American man, Alcuin, reminiscent of the sorts of Benjamin Rush and Noah Webster. Alcuin asks Mrs. Carter whether she's a Federalist, to which she sarcastically suggests he ask instead about the price of ribbon, things belonging to a woman's province. She says, "What have I as a woman to do with politics? Even the government of our country, which is said to be the freest in the world, passes over women as if they were not. We are excluded from all political rights without the least ceremony. And then Mrs. Carter goes on logically to destroy every one of Alcuin's explanations, attempting to justify female exclusion. And he is finally forced to declare, as a mother, pressing a charming babe to her bosom, as my companion in the paths of love or poetry or science, her dignity would shine forth. But as a national ruler, as busied in political intrigues and cares, as burdened with the gravity of a judge, as a champion in senatorial warfare, it would be difficult to behold her without regret and disapprobation. And then he says, these emotions I should not pretend to justify, but such and so difficult to vanquish is prejudice. And this prejudice, for I agree with Alcuin, that is what it was, began to take constitutional form. Historians have offered multiple explanations for what Rosemary Zagari rightly calls a backlash against women's inclusion in the political state. The violence of the French Revolution tainted rights rhetoric. Posthumous publication of Wollstonecraft's life with details about her suicide and attempts at suicide and out-of-wedlock pregnancy radicalized her arguments. Debates over expanding universal male suffrage sacrificed women. The rise of organized political parties led to male identity politics. Romanticization of the domestic realm rebranded confinement to the domestic as a privilege. Public funding of male education accelerated male opportunities. New Jersey demonstrates the backlash. Beginning in 1799, criticism arose from male liberals about female voting. Lawyer William Griffith, for example, wanted expanded male suffrage without property requirements, but he wanted to exclude women and African Americans. These outright attacks on female voting made little progress. A newspaper editorial in 1800 proclaimed, "Our Constitution gives this right to maids and widows, black and white." And so opponents turned increasingly to complaining about voter fraud. That is, a woman might be separated from her husband. An African American might not have papers to prove freedom. Married women look exactly like single women. And so eliminating so-called voter fraud became inevitable disenfranchisement. That is, ensuring that married women did not vote became more important than ensuring that unmarried women could vote. And the same dynamic played out in New Jersey with respect to race. And so in 1807, New Jersey passed a new law that only free white male citizens could vote. New Jersey's disenfranchisement reflected a wave of constitutional exclusion. As new states entered the Union, voter requirements shifted. In 1792, Kentucky broadened suffrage for white men, and it became the first Western state to permit men to vote without property or tax-paying requirements, but it did so by describing voters as free male citizens. By 1802, the Kentucky model proved dominant. Every state admitted to the Union between 1802 and 1876 defined suffrage by constitutional exclusion. The law began with an adjective, free or white, and after 1820, almost always white. And it ended with a description, person, inhabitants, citizen. But what never varied was the word male. Women were constitutionally excluded because they were not male. In the 1780s, the age of the Constitution had begun with arguments for greater participation in government. And by the 19th century, greater participation in government had occurred. By 1840, more than 90% of white men could vote, but at an enormous cost. Like people of color, women found themselves constitutionally excluded because they were not white men. Eliza Harriot's life followed a similar trajectory. Columbia prospered, becoming the location for the public university. But Eliza Harriot did not find her way inside those doors. Her activities between 1799 and 1811 are a mystery, but sometime in the late spring of 1811, she died. The inventory suggests she was living in one room in someone's house. Her estate included spectacles, needlework, books, a watch, a chamber pot, a bed quilt, an umbrella, and a note for $160. It was not a large sum of money. The reward for an escaped enslaved person in the June 1811 Charleston paper was $50. She left her property to two young women, daughters of her executor, but neither daughter's life altered because of the inheritance. They both married, inherited enslaved people from their father, and left for Alabama. And in the following years, the example she represented seemed to be rejected. Another lady lecturer, feminist Frances Wright, had her orations mocked. She was portrayed as a goose with the comment, "a goose that deserves to be hissed." Prominent African-American female lecturer Maria Stewart noted in 1832, "The frowns of the world shall nevertheless never discourage me." In 1871, Frank Leslie's newspaper depicted New Jersey women voting, but described it as a custom now happily obsolete. And Rush's insistence on female education for the domestic realm triumphed in the concurrence by Supreme Court Justice Bradley. Myra Bradley argued she'd met all the educational requirements to be a lawyer, save she was female, and so Illinois was constitutionally required to admit her. And the court rejected her claim. Justice Bradley explained, "The paramount destiny and mission of woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. And the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things. And things cannot be based upon exceptional cases. The general constitution of things, with things ambiguously defined, governed." But recall Eliza Harriot's words. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame. And if we look carefully, we see examples following the path that Eliza Harriot tried to open, each one imitated and improved on by a later woman. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Grimke sisters, who wrote the Seneca Falls Declaration of Rights and Sentiments and agitated for married women's property rights, or African-American women's rights activists like the Philadelphia Fortin sisters. These women were all educated, often at female schools, and they grew comfortable as public lecturers, and many of them tried teaching. For them, female education and the vote were two sides of the same coin. And so it's not surprising that the first efforts to re-enfranchise women permitted women to vote in school district elections, or that the first woman to vote under unrestricted suffrage was Utah school teacher Seraph Young in 1870, or that Mary Ann Shadd Cary, the African-American teacher, later lawyer, was the first African-American woman to register to vote in 1871 amid widespread effort by women in 1870, 1872 to register. We often tell the story of female efforts at political participation as a long series of exceptions with many failures. And one might look at Eliza Harriot's life, London, Dublin, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Alexandria, Edenton, Charleston, Savannah, Augusta, Columbia, as a series of failures. But I think Eliza Harriot would disagree. She insisted that her exertions were to serve as an example for others. And our history shows a long line of female examples, each one imitated and improved on by those who came after, each one serving as an example for eloquent emulation. In May 1787, George Washington heard Eliza Harriot deliver a lecture on the power of eloquence and the power of being an example, no matter how small. In the 1780s, the age of the Constitution rearranged assumptions about who constituted the state. The concept of female genius developed as a rebuttal to alleged female inferiority. In 1787, Eliza Harriot's example may have been a catalyst that rendered the Constitution's language gender-neutral and left a Constitution whose words seemed consistent with female genius. But her example also inspired opposition, and in the 1790s, as female genius became the rights of woman, This opposition grew until the constitutional state and the patriarchal state became assumed to be one and the same. But who knows what ripples went forth from her lectures, her schools, and her many newspaper ads. To paraphrase the 1787 May account, superficial observers, accustomed to undervaluing all female talent, might think her lecture was only worth condescension. But those of us with judgment and penetration will conclude that she was worthy of our attention. Her performance was not revolutionary, but as an early example of the path for women from female education towards college and the forum and beyond, and as a reminder that the Constitution was drafted in a world far more diverse than our conventional story insists, her performance was certainly tolerable. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was wonderful. We have a bit of time for questions. If anyone would like to
Yeah, I'm happy to ask a question.
some questions, we have microphones here in the center. And afterwards, we'll have a reception. All invited.
So you often use the phrase female genius, and I can't help wondering what was going on in the heads of, I'm going to call them feminists of the period. They made claims for gender equality. Did they think they were smarter than men?
So I guess I should stay here. I'm a walker, so I feel very imprisoned here. But so genius is a word the idea of the word shifting in that space, and it's actually quite interesting. It's shifting from a word that means capacity into a word that's going to begin to mean sort of romantic exceptionalism. And female genius begins being used by a lot of women in that time, and also men who are sort of incest, who imagine it not as an exceptional attitude, but as equally capable or having equal capacity. And then genius sort of floats out into the 19th century romantic idea of somebody being a particular genius, but it doesn't have that context. And so one of the things that's particularly interesting is in this late 18th century period, beginning sort of in the 1750s into the 1760s, you see the phrase over and over again, and it's this insistence on women's equal capacity. And so what you also find is you find people going back to the 1600s and 1700s and republishing, as if they were new, older feminist texts, sort of showing long lists of women as geniuses. So it's more understood as a capacity argument. So I don't think they think women are smarter. They're making a claim against this sort of inferiority tradition in the Western tradition.
Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. And I couldn't help when you were basically telling us this period of much more diversity that we often imagine about, that moment of debate and right in the context of the Constitution, what happened afterwards. And then you basically gave us the answer. But your list of reasons of what produced the backlash seem in tension with the very short period of time from which, the main character was promoting women's rights and what happened with the very brutal backlash in terms of just reinforcing patriarchy and excluding women. And I wonder what lessons you draw from this experience. I mean, it's obviously always hard to figure out what's going to happen, and one has to do what one believes in. But it seems like this wonderful moment where things seem to be much more open and fluid was very aggressively and violently curtailed. And so I wonder whether you have any thoughts about, this relationship between political change and agency and structural problems that might hinder them.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite interesting. Like if you can find people on all sorts of interesting reformist vectors who in 1787, there's the people associated with abolition in Philadelphia, they really believe the British are going to vote to abolish the slave trade. I mean, they believe that. Like, we know that's crazy, and how could you have believed that, and everything like that, but they're in correspondence. So people who are interested in political reform believe they're living in this reform golden age, and that's not what happens. So it's not just on the vector line of gender. You could show it on a whole series of vector lines. And I think, I happen to be very sympathetic to, on the one hand, a group of people who argue that publicity around the way that the French Revolution is experienced makes a certain radicalizes people's arguments in a way that makes them resonate differently. And that's clearly what happens in some ways to women's rights arguments, along with a lot of other rights-based arguments. But Jerry Leonard and Saul Cornell have just published a book on sort of the 19th century, and they argue, and I think quite persuasively, that a big chunk of this is also just a very complicated story about a sort of rise of a white male image of constitutional government over the 19th century, both at the state and federal level, and that's accomplished by exclusion, and that squishes out these possibilities. And so, I've become a big believer in not thinking that women were, I think this is what you're going to see around the centennial of women's voting, is not that they were enfranchised, but they were re-enfranchised, because I think there's a lot of people who now feel that the way we tell the narrative, in which it's a Whig narrative of like, hey, isn't it great, instead of thinking of it as a narrative like there were these moments and then they were crushed and then not completely come again. I don't know what that means if one's trying to be a revolutionary, but for me as a historian, it's a lot about as much contingency as a sort of long arc going in one direction.
So I'm going to ask a question, but I also want to encourage the students in the audience to think about asking a question. I see lots of students here. We've just had 3 faculty members ask questions, so I will ask a question. But as I mentioned,
there's no. When I gave a talk, let me just explain. I gave a talk similar to this, based on a little bit on this at Mount Vernon. And like the first question I get is this, and they're like, I saw a picture of bathing machines in your slides. Can you talk about bathing machines? And I was like, yeah, I actually know a lot about bathing machines and how they worked. And I was really happy to answer that question. So there's no topic that I'm not happy to talk about.
So please, as I'm asking a question, if people have questions, students, please think about them and come up. So what a great project. Thank you so much for coming to talk with us about them. I'm going to ask you a methods question, which is, how'd you find her?
Yeah.
And tell us about the process of digging through everything that you had to dig through to find all these references. And also, were there dead ends that you had to deal with, and how did you sort of work through the dead ends process?
So she'd been known about for a long time. In fact, she really fascinated Charles Warren, who wrote one of the first narrative histories. He's the first person who really found a lot of the fact that some of the newspaper ads. There's this note in Washington's diary, and then he tagged it with these ads that he had found about her advertisements. And so she's not completely unknown, although what her actual name is and the backstory, I think, has been less well known. It's almost all the product of digital newspaper archives. So this is, in some ways, like I think in some ways my first book, there's a lot of work that would have been impossible to do in a world where you didn't have digital resources. So what you can do now is you can, I'm sure Georgetown has this. It's actually super fun if you're bored, probably better than surfing the web and other things. You can go and you can look in old newspapers, and you can browse them and you can word search them, and you find all sorts of crazy things. And so for me, it's part of a much bigger project on, I think we misunderstand the framing of the Constitution because we're always inside the room. And I think that disables our understanding, and it leads us to focus on missing all the influences that were running into that room. Many of people who come to Philadelphia that summer to be part of that space. And so I think when you move out to something like a newspaper, you're actually experiencing the world more the way that that people at the time experienced the world. There are 10 billion dead ends, and I can't even begin to tell you how many. She never ran the same ad. There's newspaper misprints. The word searches are impossible. Even yesterday, I found an ad that I didn't know I didn't have before. And I was obsessed with what happened to her husband. And I don't know, and that's really annoying. Like, I almost gave up the whole project because I was like, does he die? I think he goes to Ireland to try and sell land for speculation to European investors. But I'm like, not sure. And, if his name was like Jeremiah Eggleston or something like that, I would be like, well, I'm pretty sure I've done it. But I can only tell you how many John O'Connors there are. And this is the advantage of doing this project at BC, is one of the interesting things is the name O'Connor. So O'Connor is an Irish Catholic name. It had been, it's actually a name that descends through the ancient Irish families, royal families. And they had all been suppressed, obviously, during the 18th century. And it's in this period that they begin to reclaim some status. And so they start adding the O back into their names, right? So now like O'Connor, just like people start adding Mick back. But of course, the minute some people start reclaiming O and Mick to show they're descended, because nobody actually knows who's descended, everybody starts adding O and Mick. And so in this period, people who were named O'Connor were often named Connor, O'Connor, and so it was like a complete nightmare. So yes, like I could talk for hours of thousands of dead ends, lost and whatever.
So following up on the religious sort of angle that just came up obliquely, I'd be curious to hear more about her religious affiliation, and then also on one of the slides you showed, I think it was like the other academy. It was a long list of very high-ranking clergymen. I saw William White's name, big Episcopal bishop.
Right.
And so I was wondering if her academies were always facing these better-funded, denominationally supported educational institutions for women, and whether there is a bit of a religious angle to her kind of lack of success in these new places where there were, the same time, I'm thinking about Mary Kelly's work here, a push to have organized denominational education through churches.
Yeah, so I don't know her religion. She's married in the Church of England. He would have been, in order to become a barrister in Dublin at that time, you had to have technically converted to Church of England also. So they probably are Church of England. I don't find them in any roles, and certainly when they get to South Carolina, they seem to possibly be hanging with people who are like proto-Methodists, so who knows what they are. She is in, I think, not just in the way you say, which I think is an excellent point about religion, she's very much in opposition to a established power structure. Interestingly, not so much in New York, where she's quite successful and seems to have been successful with Columbia, but in Philadelphia, where there was a very powerful effort to try and, in essence, control female education and to see itself as being liberal. She runs into just enormous problems. And she ends up being pretty successful in South Carolina, where she spins a little bit in South Carolina to be like, you could be fancy. Like fancy, you don't have to send your kids somewhere fancy. And then on the side, she's like, astronomy, geography, math. But she's also playing the kind of what people are willing to pay for. Because fundamentally, she has no money. And so for her, this is always about money. And she's married to this wonderfully romantic person who's, as far as I can tell, never makes a cent, except loses all the money. And because of coverture, she's, my husband's always like, this is kind of a depressing talk for husbands. And I'm always like, sorry about that. He is kind of like the ball and chain on her career, which is what so many women who go into teaching find as academies. So who you find teaching in this period is you find single women, Catherine Beecher being a great example, right? She doesn't want to get married. She needs an income. She gets an, and you find married women whose husbands were in essence economically underperforming. But yeah, I don't think anybody sorry, maybe that wasn't the precise best way to put it, but I don't think anybody in the Philadelphia hierarchy, particularly the church, likes what she's doing. And she uses Christian, but almost not at all.
Sorry, Eloise, another faculty member. Wonderful talk.
Thanks,
and
Jim.
extremely interesting. I just wonder if obviously the other segment of people who were disenfranchised would be the slaves. And did she have any recognition of this, and how did that exhibit itself?
Yeah, no, there's nothing, because it's just advertisements. I have no papers from her or no nothing. So I have no sense of their relationship at all. A couple things that O'Connor writes, her husband writes for papers, imply liberation in a broad idea, like, in essence, in a quasi-abolitionist way, but not in anything specific. Her model in Philadelphia, the people who follow her model are people like the Fortens, who, very prominent African-American women, basically among the free African-American community, and they start going to school and then lecturing. So you can see the same path being there. I think the thing for me that's probably most uncomfortable about it is what they do is they move steadily south. And I think that really shows in some ways, the privileging of whiteness. That is, as she moves south, the enslaved reality of the economy allow her to make a living in a space where she's less successful in Philadelphia. There's no evidence about her, but there's a horrible part in the Grimke Diary of Charleston about a period about 20 years later, where she's talking about the school that she was educated at, which was a later female academy. And she talks about their abusive use of enslaved people as a way to basically have the labor to fund this. So I suspect there's a less, a much more problematic underpiece of this. Her executor owns, the person who is the executor of her will, owns enslaved people, and she, like a number of other women, white women who are widows in this period, eventually move south to basically become pensioners on plantations. And I think that's a real, a very uncomfortable reality about that aspect of the story. Good?
So I think we'll draw this to a conclusion. Thank you, Mary, so much for educating
Thank
us,
you.
for enlightening us, to make us all feel like we underperformed. But that's good. And so please join me in thanking Mary. I hope the conversation continues at our reception. Everyone is invited.
Yeah, what's